Okay. All right, I feel like we're all here. We should get the show on the road. Welcome to the very first colloquium of the year. This is very exciting. We are delighted to have Lizzie Brannon here from the Political Science Department. She's an assistant professor with us and works on questions of gender and conflict, and political representation among women, especially in post-conflict contexts. So we are so excited she's presenting with us today. You can see the title of her talk, The Gender Dynamics of Combatants, Electoral Success in Colombia. So we're super looking forward to that. Before we get to the general rules of the game here, I just want to announce we have a fantastic research series presentation happening on Wednesday with Simon Skalski. And then on next week, we have Sebastian Galliano coming to present at the colloquium, and Gustavo Torrens will be hosting that one. Okay, so I think many of you have been here for these before, but for those of you that have not, the general rules of the game, as it were, are this is recorded. So we do record all of these. And also, this presentation's usually 40 minutes or so, 40 to 45 minutes. Clarifying questions generally welcome. But other discussion questions we hold till the end. Once we're done, I will moderate the conversation, keep the queue on and offline. And just as a reminder, the first question usually goes to a grad student. So grad students be thinking your question along the way, so there's not that awkward side. Exactly. Exactly. All right. So if everybody can join me in welcoming Lizzie Brannon, and we'll get started.
All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Jess, for that lovely introduction. I'm very excited to be here with you today. My name is Lizzie Brannon. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science. As Jess mentioned, my research primarily centers on political violence and its legacies. And so within that, I'm interested in understanding the dynamics of women's participation in non-state armed groups, and then how their participation can at times be transformative for women's rights and representation generally. But I'm also interested in the kind of individual level experiences. So how women's participation in war shapes then their post-war opportunities and careers. So the paper that I am presenting today considers these very dynamics. We focus on how female ex-rebels fare in post-war elections, and specifically how voters perceive them compared to their male counterparts. So this paper is co-authored with Laura Huber, who's an assistant professor at the University of Kentucky, and Julian Acevedo Pardo, who is an independent researcher in Colombia. I should say this is a new paper. It's our first time presenting this, so I'm very excited to get some feedback and see what you all think. Okay, so I'd like to start off with a motivating example of Vera Grave for this project. So in 1974, a group of university students, including Vera Grave, formed the 19th of April, also known as M19 in Colombia, in response to allegations of fraud in the 1970s election. Grave became a very influential person within this organization. She was eventually appointed as a top commander. And really her role in M19 is pretty extraordinary in a lot of ways. So few rebel groups count women as a part of their founding members, and then women tend to pretty rarely climb the ladder to leadership in a lot of militant groups. And then after conflict, the kind of mainstream narrative that we have in the literature is that very few former rebel women hold political roles. And so Grave really defied sort of all of these norms. After M19 left the battlefield for electoral politics, she became a quite influential political figure for the party. She was the first ex-M19 guerrilla to be elected when she won a seat in the House of Representatives in 1990. And then she served as senator from 91 to 94. She even ran on the as vice president on the presidential ticket in 2002, and has held an assortment of political roles in Colombia. And so taking what we know about patterns of women's roles in rebel groups during the war, and then also their role in rebel parties, which are those rebel groups that transition into political parties after war, her success really seems pretty unique. And one might assume that she had to fight really against pretty strong sort of patriarchal party structures that really maintain kind of post-war status. But actually, records suggest that there were some leaders in M19 that actually sought out female rebel candidates. So in her autobiography, Grave recalls a top M19 commander, Carlos Pizarro, insisting that party lists should be composed of only women guerrilla candidates because, as he said, women were quote unquote a guarantee. The party, unsurprisingly, did not end up doing that. But still, his statements and then Grave's political success really do suggest perhaps women could be somewhat of a winning strategy in these post-war elections. And then her case also underscores the importance of analyzing whether there is a greater political role for women, or whether having a greater political role for women during war can then enhance their political viability after war. So we know a lot about how women are perceived in rebel groups during conflict. We have pretty abundant research about the average rebel women's transition back into their communities and the challenges that accompany it, but a lot less is understood about the role of rebel women in politics. While a lot of research shows that they are primarily sidelined, this example, and then also a lot of my other research has challenged this and shown that rebel women are really pretty present in electoral politics and at higher levels than we previously understood. So bringing kind of all of these lenses together, if rebel women are running in elections, we want to understand how are they actually perceived by voters, right? So specifically, as M19's leadership suggested, is it actually a winning strategy to run former rebel women? And so we asked specifically how the gender of an ex-rebel candidate impacts their likelihood of electoral success. How do voters perceive female ex-rebel candidates compared to male ex-rebel candidates? And then secondly, we also want to understand how this relationship could vary based on the wartime experiences of individual rebels. So how to say like their reputation of engaging in violence, for example, interact with their gender and perhaps temper the levels of support that they receive. So in answering these questions today, I'm going to start by briefly discussing some of the existing research on rebel party politics and women's roles in rebel parties and women's political representation. And then I will introduce our theory in which we argue that female ex-rebels will generally be viewed more favorably by voters, but that this will depend on their wartime experiences. So we expect that when women held more kind of gender conforming roles, when they had more sort of community oriented motivations for joining, and when their units had reputations for cooperating with civilians rather than targeting them with violence, we expect that they will fare better. To test this theory, we use a conjoint experiment fielded online in Colombia last winter. So I'll walk you through our conjoint design. I'll show you our results, which suggests largely as we expected that female ex-rebels are actually viewed more favorably, although this does vary on those factors that I discussed. And then I'll conclude with some implications of this. So starting off with the existing work on rebel parties. So the election of former rebels into political office is quite common after war. One reason for this is that the integration of former rebel groups into electoral politics has become this like really common sort of like peace building strategy, with a lot of peace agreements following the Cold War, including an electoral participation provision that legalizes the transition of rebel groups into political parties and their participation in elections. So we see that about 50% of rebel groups transition into political parties. And among those groups that do transition, most win at least one seat in their first national election that they participate in. And nearly all of those winning parties go on to continue running and winning in subsequent elections. And really, rebel parties in a lot of cases become quite successful and powerful. It's fairly common that they may even hold a majority of seats within their national legislatures. And then they also pursue a number of positions in subnational elections as well. So there's quite an active literature on rebel party dynamics, a lot of work on the conditions under which they adapt and succeed in post-war politics, and then also their effect on post-war peace and stability. But we understand a lot less about the individual representatives who make up these parties. And so the work on candidacy in rebel parties is rather limited, but hopefully growing. And so what we do know, however, suggests that rebel veterans are often run as candidates. They don't exclusively represent the candidates though, or and also don't exclusively represent those who are elected. This is for a couple of reasons. So first, for a lot of the people who participate in rebel groups, their primary skills will lie in fighting, right, and not in politics. And then beyond this, rebel parties also have incentives to actually run newcomers, right? It offers the signal that the party has changed and moved on from their wartime identity. And then of course, rebel candidates might come with a lot of baggage in the eyes of voters having, possibly committed a lot of crimes during the war. And so this means that rebel parties typically have a strategy of running a mixture of ex-rebel and civilian candidates. And we have some work that shows that they're very purposeful about this, right? Running those ex-rebel candidates in strongholds from the war versus civilian candidates in what was considered more competitive districts. So in some of my developing work, I have focused the last couple years on putting together a data set on the representation of ex-rebels in rebel parties. And so I show that on average, about 30% of party seats are typically held by rebel veterans. About 10% of party seats are specifically held by female ex-rebel veterans. And then the remaining 20% is by male rebel veterans. But again, we know relatively little still about how candidates are actually selected, which rebel candidates are deemed more appealing. And really that focuses primarily on party strategy without considering how voters are actually perceiving candidates. And we also don't know how female and male candidates are perceived by voters. And so this motivates our question of how do voters evaluate ex-rebel candidates, and how do these evaluations vary by their wartime characteristics and gender? So in trying to understand how voters would theoretically then perceive female ex-rebel candidates, it's necessary to rely on some of the literature on perceptions of rebel women during war. So women often mobilize into rebel groups during conflict. So about 60% of groups that emerged between 1946 and 2015 had women members, and their roles in rebel groups vary substantially. Some women serve as top commanders and leaders, others serve primarily in support roles. And really, perceptions of women's interests into these groups vary. These are non-conventional roles for women to hold. And so at times we see women being really kind of welcomed and celebrated in these positions, and other times being punished for their participation. So sort of like common conceptualization about gender roles and war would render women as the quote unquote beautiful souls in need of protection, and men as the just warriors offering that protection. And so women are then expected to be innocent and passive and pacific and maternal in these times of conflict, while men's roles in violence are seen as kind of more normal. And so in women join rebel groups, it's seen as very unusual, though it is fairly common. And as the public generally tries to make sense of this unusualness of their entrance into these violent political organizations, we see several sort of narrative frames emerge. So the primary framework is offered by Sojberg and Gentry, and they argue that women who are committing political violence are perceived as either mothers, monsters, or whores. And the motherhood frame casts women's choice to join as this extension of maternal desire to protect their families, their communities. And rebel groups really commonly highlight this frame. They even use it to bolster public support. They draw on these assumptions about the kind of moral and political values of mothers. So for instance, we often see like posters of the militant mother with, holding her baby and a gun. But of course, that public perception is not always so positive. So we also see these frames of women as the quote unquote monsters, quote unquote whores, as also being very common, particularly when their participation is framed around some sort of gender norm incongruity. So in these cases, women who choose to defy norms around, say, passivity and peacefulness among their gender are viewed as being pro-violent at a level also beyond their male colleagues. And then also their sexual behavior is often assumed, right? And it's kind of cast on them assumption that it drives their desire to participate and commit violence. And so these frames are often tied to very high levels of stigma and discrimination against rebel women, particularly after they return home after the war. So this leaves a bit of a puzzle in terms of how rebel women would really be evaluated as political candidates after war, and suggests that it really might depend on how their general experience in the war is perceived. And then, of course, research on women in politics is also pretty informative on this topic. So voters often use heuristic shortcuts to make assumptions about political candidates, looking to their gender or their prior occupations, among other things, as cues for a candidate's skills or personalities and priorities. And particularly often use gender stereotypes to assume that women will hold certain traits and be more effective at certain issues. And so at times, these stereotypes can actually advantage women, and at other times they can pretty severely disadvantage them depending on the context. And so applying this to post-war contexts, on the one hand, women generally might be disadvantaged because we know that when there are perceived security threats, voters tend to prefer candidates with more stereotypically masculine characteristics versus feminine ones. But at the same time, research has also shown that voters in post-war contexts are looking for candidates who can bolster peace and security, which can then advantage women candidates. And so we build on this premise and our theory to apply it to rebel women. We argue that rebel women will actually be at an advantage and that they may be able to convincingly signal competence due to their wartime roles, competence and security, while also then being stereotyped for this kind of commitment to peace due to their gender. And so our theory is as follows, that support for ex-rebel candidates will vary by gender, with women generally being more favored than men. But as I discussed, we know that these perceptions of rebel women can really vary significantly based on how their roles are perceived. And so when they are viewed, for instance, as more committed to their community or fulfilling a maternal role, they're seen more positively. But when they are associated with violence or breaking strong gendered norms, they're viewed in a really negative light. And so we generally expect that women rebels will be seen more favorably, but we argue that this will also vary according to their role type, their ties to civilians, and their associations to violence. So I'll break down each of these arguments as I present hypotheses. So first, gender stereotypes might advantage former rebel women compared to men who are former rebels. So again, gender stereotypes tend to cast women as more peaceful, less aggressive, more altruistic than men. And as a result, women are often assumed to kind of be reluctant members of armed groups. Women combatants are viewed to be less motivated by self-interest or ideology and more likely to be pursuing these sort of altruistic goals. Like the mother framing kind of would suggest, these stereotypes are then rooted in women's sort of traditional society roles. And so former rebel women might be viewed as more kind of community oriented and selfless, which then might increase public support for them. And then at the same time, while men's association with security and violence can create bias against women because they're seen as less competent in security, this bias might actually be attenuated by women's participation in rebel groups. So women fighters have the opportunity to kind of quote unquote prove themselves as effective security actors, and their experience in the rebel group might eliminate any of that sort of bias that women face in terms of security threats due to their demonstrated agency within a security focused group. And so for those reasons, we expect that female former rebel candidates will receive more support than male former rebel candidates. And again, we expect that this is going to vary according to a number of wartime experiences. So starting with wartime roles. So in general, feminine stereotypes might lead to greater support for women rebel candidates. These stereotypes assume that women are going to act in certain ways or have certain attributes. And when the public is then presented with information that either confirms or then challenges those assumptions, this provides them with more information that can influence their evaluation of candidates. So role congruity theory, for instance, argues that an individual will be positively evaluated when their characteristics or behavior align with that group's perceived social role. So for a woman who acts in a masculine way, the incongruity between feminine stereotypical expectations and outcomes might then lead to negative reactions. So for instance, while rebel women have in general kind of violated traditional feminine stereotypes by joining the group, this might be sort of forgiven by the public if they assume, for the reasons already discussed, that women were these sort of reluctant, non-violent members of the group. But if they are then presented with differing information that highlights women's violence or their roles in that violence, voters then might reduce their support for women and then might also punish them and reduce support for these women more so than men. And so we argue that voter support for female rebel candidates will depend on whether they held gender conforming roles during the war. So we consider these to be either support roles or also medical care compared to, for instance, serving as, say, a soldier or a commander. And then we next consider motivations, women's motivations for joining rebel groups. So again, gender stereotypes cast women as being less agentic, less selfish. And so as a result, women tend to be viewed as these reluctant members of armed groups who felt forced to join for the protection of their families or communities rather than for their personal gain. And so for women who joined a rebel group for a communitarian reason, such as a desire to protect their family or their community, we expect that they would then receive greater support than women candidates who are seen as joining for more individualistic reasons, like those who joined because they personally believed in the group's goal, or they followed, say, a romantic partner to the group, or they were pursuing economic opportunities. And so this leads to our third hypothesis, that voters will have more support for women rebel candidates who join the war for some kind of community-oriented reason rather than an individual motivation. We also consider how female rebels interact with civilians. So since women are viewed as more community-oriented and less violent, women rebels who worked with local community leaders to, say, improve community conditions would theoretically be viewed more favorably. So rebel groups, of course, are often, most known for their violence, but a lot of rebel groups also offer governance services to their communities, like providing education, healthcare, law enforcement, etc. And a lot of times women's participation in rebel groups actually expands rebel governance programs, both in scope and in quantity. And so women involved in these sort of rebel governance programs might not only be engaged in roles that echo some of those traditional gender roles, but also would then conform to kind of expectations that women would be more intrinsically motivated by the good of others. And so women rebels whose units work really closely with local community leaders to, say, improve community conditions should theoretically receive more support. So this leads to our fourth hypothesis, that voters will have more support for women rebel candidates whose units worked closely with community leaders. Last hypothesis slide, I promise. So lastly, we consider female rebels association to violence. So women rebels who violate gender stereotypes, especially those committed to or those related to nonviolence, might be punished by voters. Women rebels who engage in violence are often portrayed as being kind of particularly evil, and especially compared to their male counterparts, because their violence violates these traditional norms. And also women who engage in violence are often viewed as just pawns who have been manipulated by violent men, right? And who have kind of forfeited their agency in that regard. And this is especially true for women who are associated with sexual violence. This not only violates assumptions of their own nonviolence, but it also then is a violation of sexual norms and women's assumed empathy with other women. So in short, since women are typically the victims of sexual violence, it's often assumed that women would be opposed to the use of sexual violence by combatants. And so when their units or they themselves commit this form of violence during war, this violates gender stereotypes in a very multifaceted way, and might significantly degrade support for them. And so this leads to our last two hypotheses. First, that voters will have less support for female rebel candidates whose units targeted civilians with violence. And second, that they'll have less support for female rebel candidates whose units targeted civilians with sexual violence. So I know I just threw a lot at you, a lot of hypotheses. So I will just quickly recap them in a short little table here. So first, we argued that female rebels will receive more voter support than male rebels just generally. And then we expected this to vary by wartime experiences. So our second hypothesis argued that gender conforming roles like medical or support roles will be associated with greater support. Our third hypothesis argued that those with community-oriented reasons for joining will be more likely to receive support. Fourth hypothesis argued that those units that worked more closely with communities will receive more support. And then our fifth hypothesis argued that those who targeted civilians either with violence generally or specifically with sexual violence will receive less support. Okay, so how do we go about testing this? So we used an online conjoint survey in Colombia. This was administered in December 2024. We had a sample of about 1,300 Colombian adults who were drawn from NetQuest's online panel that had quotas for sex, age, socioeconomic level, geographic location, in a way that matched Colombian census data. In the conjoint, we only compare former guerrilla member candidates, and we vary attributes inherent to their experience, along with some other relevant demographic factors like age, gender, which group they were a part of, their wartime role, their marital status, whether they have children, their recruitment, their ties to violence, and then their policy priority. So we provide respondents with a short vignette that introduces them to the profile of two hypothetical candidates for mayor in the municipality or city where they live. And then we show the profiles of 2 hypothetical candidates side by side, randomly varying each candidate's attribute levels. And then each respondent had 3 tasks of the same conjoint. So they solved 3 pairs and evaluated each of them. So Colombia, we think, is a useful setting for this analysis for a number of reasons, including its varied experiences of civil conflict and its political integration of rebels. So the country has been involved in civil conflict for more than 60 years with various armed groups participating. The Colombian state has initiated peace negotiations with some of these armed groups and successfully negotiated agreements in some cases. So for example, they struck a peace deal with M19 in the 90s, and then more recently, of course, with FARC in 2016. And so as a result of these peace deals, former guerrilla members have been able to participate in local and national elections and secure, in some cases, elected positions. So for instance, M19 members have occupied several elected positions. Most notably, a former M19 member, Gustavo Petro, won the presidential election in 2022. On the other hand, while former FARC members haven't really obtained wide electoral success since the agreement, a few of them have won more subnational positions like mayoral elections and other elected positions. And so we think that this presents a fairly realistic context to actually conduct our analysis, since former rebel members do regularly participate in electoral contests. And so while we think it's a good context to run the experiment and to analyze our question, we actually think it actually represents a hard case scenario for the success of former rebel candidates and the political viability of this type of candidate. So in general, even though we've seen some M19 members achieve really important electoral victories, overall, the popularity of these groups in Colombia is very, very low. And the popularity of individuals, of former rebels running for office is also quite low, and they tend to lack electoral success or electoral support in comparison to some other contexts in which rebels are much more kind of dominating in politics. So respondents were given this vignette and then shown 3 pairs of candidate profiles and asked then which of the 2 people they were shown was most desirable choice for mayor. So we said, imagining the following candidates are running for mayor in the upcoming local elections and the municipality/city that you live in. Both candidates have relatively similar political agendas and ideological beliefs and have made similar statements about what policies they would pursue as mayor. Please indicate which of the 2 theoretical candidates you'd personally vote for if you had to choose. We have several attributes, so we include gender, including man or woman, groups. We have M19 and FARC, their experience in those groups, so whether they served as a soldier, a commander, a political leader, a nurse or doctor, or some sort of manual laborer. We include the type of recruitment, so including whether they joined because they thought it would provide them or their family and community with security and protection, whether they believed in the group's ideological goals, whether they were following a romantic partner, whether they wanted to improve their economic opportunities, or if they were forcibly recruited. And then we also include information about the reputation of that unit towards civilians. So whether their unit was accused of killing civilians who weren't involved in fighting and weren't in an armed group or the military, if their group was accused of sexual violence, if their group was not accused of any direct violence against civilians, and then if their unit worked with local community leaders. And then we have a number of other attributes that we use primarily as controls, including policy priority, age, education level, marital status, and then whether the candidates have children. And then finally, after they were shown each pair, they were asked to answer 3 questions. So we asked which of the candidates they thought was most desirable on a scale of 1 to 10. How much do you approve of each candidate? And then which candidate do you think is more committed to peaceful politics? Respondents were also asked then a number of questions that we used as control variables or for subgroup analyses, including their political ideology, their policy priority, whether they had kind of more hawkish or dovish inclinations, and then also prior victimization status in the conflict. We also asked a number of questions related to their gendered beliefs, and we also had a hostile and benevolent sexism scale included. And then finally, we had several attention checks included throughout the experiment as well. Onto the results. So in analyzing the conjoint results, we estimate marginal means with 95% confidence intervals and standard errors clustered by respondents. So marginal means here estimates the probability of choosing a candidate given that they have a certain attribute level. So in the results that we show, estimates above a 0.5 would indicate that on average candidates with that attribute level would have a predicted probability of being chosen greater than 50%. Estimates below 0.5 would indicate a lower predicted probability of being selected than 50%. And all of the results that I'll show you are based on the forced choice hypothetical candidate. So would you choose candidate A or candidate B? So the results of the figure show overall, respondents were more likely, so you see up here at the top, more likely to support female guerrilla candidates compared to male guerrilla candidates. And this is consistent with our expectation that given gender stereotypes like women being seen as more altruistic and peaceful and less aggressive, that the bias against female candidates would be lower than for men. And then I'll just spend a little bit of time highlighting some of our other interesting findings from the main model. So first, we find that on average, voters or respondents are more willing to vote for candidates who belong to M19, who had the role of medic. And then conversely, they more likely to reject candidates who were a part of FARC or who served as commanders or soldiers in the group. And then we found that they were fairly indifferent to those who were political leaders or had more sort of the domestic or transport roles. So we think of like the manual laborer roles, or those who joined the group for ideological or humanitarian reasons. And then I have the main model continued here to split across two slides. So a few other interesting things that we find, the respondents are more likely to support candidates who had 2 kids, those who were forcibly recruited, those who worked with community leaders to improve community conditions, and those whose units were not accused of violence against civilians. And then in contrast, they were less likely to support those who didn't have kids, those who joined the group to follow a romantic partner or for like economic self-interest, or those who committed any form of violence against civilians.
How many respondents were there?
1,300. So next we consider the interaction between gender and role type that candidates held during the war. So the results indicate that overall respondents prefer candidates who were medics over basically any other type of role, but there was a greater preference towards choosing female medics compared to male medics. And then conversely, respondents were pretty indifferent to either men or women who had supporting roles, things like cooking or cleaning or guarding or transport. And then respondents were less likely to vote for men who were soldiers and commanders, and were fairly indifferent to women who held these roles. So taken together, we see that these results kind of provide partial support for hypothesis 2. So on the one hand, the higher support for women in medical roles aligns with the expectation that there would be higher support for these kind of gender conforming roles, but this isn't consistent with those who held other sorts of gender conforming roles, such as the support positions like cooking, cleaning, guarding, etc. And then women who held non-gender conforming roles like as soldiers or commanders weren't necessarily penalized as harshly as their male counterparts. And so this might reflect some of those gender stereotypes portraying women as being less violent. And then we hypothesized that the effect of gender on voters' choice would also be mediated by ex-rebel candidates' motivation for joining the group. So this portrays that interactive dynamic. And so overall, we observed that respondents were pretty indifferent to women candidates who joined the group for sort of community-oriented reasons, so to protect their family or friends or community, also for individualistic reasons, following a romantic partner or improving economic conditions, or for ideological reasons. But they did penalize men at a higher level who joined guerrilla groups for individualistic reasons or ideological reasons, and then were fairly indifferent to those men who joined for community reasons. And so kind of on the whole, respondents prefer men and women also who were forcibly recruited into the groups, though this effect is also significantly higher for women compared to men. And so that's down here at the bottom. And so, you know, these results let us infer that women candidates are punished at lower levels than men when they join groups because of these individual reasons, but they're not rewarded for it when they do it for community reasons. And so this fails to offer any support for hypothesis 3. Okay, And then next we consider this interaction between candidate gender and their group's reputation with civilians. So overall, voters prefer candidates whose units worked with community leaders to improve conditions, and whose units did not commit acts of violence against civilians as expected. And the results show no difference in the levels of support between men and women candidates who worked with community leaders. But compared to male candidates, respondents reward female candidates to a larger extent when their units actually did commit acts of violence against civilians. They reject all candidates who committed acts of sexual violence or killed civilians, but the women in those cases were punished less harshly than men. So overall, we see we have this like less severe punishment against women candidates. And this might be related to this kind of gendered perception and expectation that still again perceive women as being more peaceful, and that these acts of violence would be contrary to those stereotypes. And so it might be the case that respondents like consider that even if their unit engaged in these acts, that greater responsibility should be assigned to men in those cases than those women. And so we conclude that this overall offers support for hypotheses 4, and then 5A and 5B. And then a couple more slides of results. So we conduct some subgroup analyses, given that respondents' gender and their gender kind of in-group preferences could be a factor that influences their voting behavior. So we examine the interactive analyses according to the respondent's sex. And so the figures portray the results of the interaction first here between candidate sex and their role in the group, based on respondent sex. So I have male respondents on the left, female respondents on the right. And the most striking result here is that female voters tend to reward female candidates who occupied the role of medic significantly more strongly than the male or compared to male candidates who had the same role. But this isn't true among the male respondents. We see no significant difference in the likelihood of male respondents choosing male versus female candidates in this role. And so from this, we infer that the overall favorability towards female medics is actually, the effect that we're finding in our main results might be driven by female voters specifically, or female respondents. So these figures then show the interaction between the candidate's gender and reason for joining the guerrilla group by respondent sex. So among male respondents, we observe that there is no statistically significant differences in their likelihood of choosing either a male or female candidate who joined the group for the same reason across all of the different attribute levels. And then in contrast, when looking at female respondents, they generally prefer female candidates over male candidates, regardless of the reason that they joined the group. But there are two exceptions to this. So first, for candidates who followed a romantic partner, female respondents rejected both male and female candidates without really significant differences in their level of rejection. And then among candidates who were forcibly recruited, we see a higher preference for female over male candidates, but the difference is not significant. Okay, and then last one. So finally, evaluating the interaction between candidate sex and their unit's reputation with civilians by respondent sex, we again see some interesting results. So first, among male respondents, there are no differences in the likelihood of choosing a male or female candidate, regardless of their unit's behavior towards civilians. And then conversely, among female respondents, they favored or at least like punished less harshly female over male candidates when their units did commit acts of violence against civilians, committed acts of sexual violence against civilians, or were generally known to have killed civilians. And the only case in which female respondents chose male and female candidates at the same rate is when the candidates' units worked very closely with those community leaders. Okay, so I know I've shown you a lot of figures, so I'll just take a moment to summarize what I've shown, and then I'll discuss some of the implications of these findings, and then I'll finish up. So first, we show that generally female ex-rebel candidates receive more support than their male peers, and so this offers support for our first hypothesis. And then our following hypotheses argued that this support would vary according to the candidate's gender and their wartime experiences. And we generally find support for this idea. So first, we find that female candidates with gender conforming roles had greater support than women with non-gender conforming roles, with the caveat that this was primarily observed among female medics, and we didn't see the same effect for those manual laborers. Second, we found little effect of recruitment, except for females that were forcibly recruited had higher support. So we have little support for hypothesis 3. Third, females whose units worked with community leaders had higher support than those who had reputations of violence. And then lastly, female candidates whose units committed violence against civilians had lower levels of support than those who did not. And then briefly, I'll just mention a couple of robustness checks that we completed. So we evaluated the conjoint against different voter dimensions or respondent dimensions, including their level of benevolent sexism, hostile sexism, gender stereotypes, conflict victimization, and their support for negotiated peace. But we didn't find any significant differences across these dimensions. Additionally, we found evidence that suggests that respondents' gender was really formative in these results. So in general, female respondents had a larger preference than male respondents for female candidates in general. They also had a larger preference than male respondents for females in those medical roles, and then a larger preference than male respondents for females whose units committed any form of violence. So to kind of wrap up, we're going to talk a little bit about what we make of this and how it squares with the existing research. So first, that male and female ex-rebel candidates are seen differently by voters is, pretty unsurprising to us given the research that we have on female rebels and how they are generally perceived by the public. So women's participation actually really can offer rebel groups a huge boost during the war. It changes their fighting skills, their capacity, and most importantly, perhaps their popular support, which then can alter their chances of winning. And so it's pretty unsurprising that these benefits would continue after war's end. And this really suggests that there actually could be some truth to that M19 commander's suggestion that women were quote unquote a guarantee. And then second, that this support is shaped by an interaction with wartime experiences also represents a pretty clear continuity with research on women's wartime experiences. It is a little surprising that we didn't actually see harsher punishment towards women who violate norms. And in fact, we saw that women violating norms were still more favorably perceived than men who also violated those norms. And so this part doesn't quite square with some of the work on female rebels' social rejection after war, which tends to suggest that they face very harsh social rejection when they are seen as norm violators. And so this really brings up kind of questions about our baseline comparison in the literature in general and how harsh men rebels are also perceived after war when they are seen as violating certain types of norms. It also could hint at the idea that even by running, these women represent a more unique subset of the rebel population. They might be seen as more professional, more political, and thus gain some level of favorability that rank and file women would not. And then finally, the degree of popularity of female ex-rebel candidates and that this was influenced so much by the respondent sex. I think there's a lot of ways to make sense of this, and so it's not surprising quite in that way. But I will say that there's not really any research that has considered the differences in how men and women generally perceive rebels and how they perceive male rebels versus female rebels. And so this finding really, I think, actually taps into something new there, and that these differences need to be explored more in the future. And then finally, just very quickly, a couple thoughts about what these findings really mean for our understanding of rebel parties and post-war politics. So there's some evidence to show that rebel parties use women's representation strategically. And primarily this argues that, they use women's representation to signal a change from their wartime practices and also to signal this kind of commitment to peace through stereotypes about women and peace. And so they've been shown to use it strategically to bolster their support. And so these findings really suggest that we should look to another place to understand these patterns, to the actual candidate selection, and understand how they're picking male versus female candidates, and specifically female civilian candidates versus female ex-rebel candidates as well. And then finally, while, you know, it's possible that rebel parties are using their former female veterans in a strategic way, I would say that this isn't necessarily a bad thing. So in some of my developing work, along with several co-authors, we have shown that higher levels of representation of female ex-rebels is actually associated with positive outcomes, including a higher likelihood of implementing peace agreements, greater levels of women's rights, and a lower likelihood of conflict relapse. All right, so with that, I will stop. And thank you all so much for listening. I look forward to your questions.
Right, the queue is open.
So thank you very much for this. This was fantastic. I was wondering if you could say a bit more about the robustness check on the conflict victimization. Just because especially since you used actual rebel group labels as part of their profiles. Just, you know, the main question that comes into my mind is then how much do personal experiences with each of those respective groups in their, you know, since you know, you have a geographic spread of surveyees. So how much that affects it. So I was wondering if you could say a bit more about that robustness check.
Should I answer collect? Okay, thanks, Harold. Yeah, great question. So we certainly expected that it would have an effect. I think as we can all understand, if you had had an experience of violence with a certain group, that would, you know, increase your bias against them. The question was worded in a way that it was sort of, you know, intentionally vague. Have you or anyone in your family experienced violence? And we didn't specify, you know, by one group or another, but it was, you know, kind of theoretically at the hands of some sort of non-state group. But really surprisingly across the subgroups, we didn't see a difference in preferences that was driven by whether or not they did experience violence during the conflict or if their family did.
Your question there?
Super interesting paper. This is very exciting. I have two questions. The first is about like how respondents were recruited. So I know that you did online, but if you could talk a little bit more about that. And the reason for my question is about, I was thinking about geographic variation across Colombia, especially for the FARC. I would imagine that people in like the interior, like more rural areas would have even more negative attitudes towards the group because the FARC is more present in those regions than the capital or big cities. So this is one. And then the result about the difference among female voters and male voters is really interesting. And I was wondering if you have the proportion of male and female respondents to see like if they're equally, so you have 50-50, how exactly is that proportion for?
Great, thank you. So yeah, we use NetQuest, which is a online survey firm. So they recruited the candidates or the respondents, but they ensured that we had geographic variation that aligned with the census. And so that included both rural and urban respondents. And so this was, again, also something that we expected that we would see a difference in the rural areas versus the urban areas because those rural areas would have been more likely to experience violence. But we didn't find any differences. And I wonder, to some extent, since the peace agreement was signed and, FARC has their 5 quota seats, that there has been just so much publicity around these candidates running for office and getting into office that also means that, those urban respondents are still having high levels of violence. But yeah, we didn't find any differences there. I don't remember off the top of my head the exact split was, but it was something around 50-50. It might have been like 49 versus 51, but like approximately 50-50 male versus female respondents.
Maybe Gustavo and Claudia.
So one clarification question, but because maybe I missed it, is exactly what were the respondents seeing? It's like there is one candidate that belongs to a rebel group, rebel candidate, but it's what are the other options? It's there so the whole pool is all rebels, or there are non-rebels in the pool too, non-rebel candidates too.
So only rebel candidates. So they were seeing like candidate A, candidate B, and then the list of attributes. I don't have exact picture of what it looked like. But you know, it would have specified like all of these attributes that we had.
I see. Because what I had in mind is essentially if you are matched with a women from a rebel candidate and then facing competition against a women from a non-rebel party or a man, I don't know, that again, that's a different type of question and maybe a different paper. Again, I'm still thinking what kind of question you are answering with this paper versus what kind of question you can answer with a paper in which you have pools of non-rebel candidates as alternatives there. But again, sorry, I cannot be more precise in my comment, okay?
So I love questions like this because then I get to talk about other things that we are doing. So we actually ran 2 experiments. So I only focused on the second conjoint, but we first ran a conjoint that compared civilian candidates with rebel candidates, and we varied basically very similar attributes. So we had gender, we had like a more kind of broad, like security experience. So there was also the option that they could have been in the military, or totally uninvolved in any sort of militant organization. And then our second conjoint, which is what I've shown you today, was only comparing rebel versus rebel candidates. And the reason for that, you know, so I mean, one, like civilian versus rebel is probably the most likely that you would see in the real world. And so it's of course important to understand like what is that baseline and how are voters actually comparing these individuals with this rebel background versus somebody else, and actually like how might gender interact with that. But then the rebel versus rebel, we really wanted to be able to get into whether female rebels were specifically going to be punished at higher or lower levels compared to their male counterparts.
Could I have a quick follow-up? So I don't know the electoral rules in Colombia, but do we have like full list for Congress? So what if you experiment a little bit with that? Essentially, it's like inside the list, I put your rebel candidate. I know in which position, maybe third, fourth position, even, or I don't know. And then there you switch between female or male. And then the comparison could be with another list with non-rebel candidates. And then you are seeing a little bit the combination of both things. And that could be very, but of course you need to run another, it's extremely expensive, but I think maybe something in that direction would be super interesting.
Yeah, that is really interesting. So yeah, that's why we chose mayoral races, is since, you know, because there are the PR list system. And so it would have been hard to have run the experiment that way. But I do like that idea of, you know, having like comparing individuals who are on the list versus like a total non-rebel list. I should say something about, so these are the results from the first conjoint that compared civilian versus rebels. So these are kind of the main results overall. So you can see still in general, we're seeing that women are preferred over men. You see the fourth box down, that is security experience. So individuals who were not members of any group or who were soldiers in the National Army were favored at much higher levels. Both of the FARC and M19 candidates were generally less favored, but FARC was far more punished than M19. And then I'll show you our breakdown by the interaction of gender and their role. So again, at the top, we have those who were not in any group, those who were in the Army. And so still in both cases, we're seeing a greater preference for women in those roles. And then at the bottom, we have women and men who were in M19 and FARC. And so again, they're still less favored, but in general, women in FARC or M19 were favored at higher levels than men.
Maria. Thank you, Lizzie. This is very exciting. I had the same that Gustavo had, but also I have other comments related to what is the validity of this, external validity. Why? Well, they might say, yes, I vote for a woman, but actually now I'm collecting data for all the municipal elections in Colombia since 1998. And the maximum number of women that have been elected as mayors, 13%. 13%. And that is the maximum that we have achieved in 2023. We started with only 5%. And the same happens across the 5,500 municipalities in the across the 344 municipalities in Chile and 204 municipalities in Ecuador. Exactly the same. So I wondered, yes, they might say this on the paper, but actually what they do is not the case. And also, the study suggests that the few women that have been elected, it has been because they are running in coalitions with other groups, not belonging to a single group. And also, I wondered in real life, if I have a candidate that was a former guerrilla, usually we never know whether she was forced to be part of the guerrilla group. We never know what was the role that she was doing in the guerrilla group. So that is unrealistically for the real people to say that. And actually today on the Colombian news, and this is related to the questions that they were saying, that probably in the jurisdictions where there is violence, there might be more violence against it. Guess what happened yesterday? The army wanted to capture one of the guerrilla leaders. It's called the Bicho de Oro, something like that, the guy of gold. And actually, the people in the municipality created a huge protest to protect him from not getting captured. So it's completely the opposite. Why? Because they are surviving from the production of cocaine, and the guerrillas are the ones allowing them to grow this cocaine. Does it make sense? So they see it as a survival instrument for them. And so if the army comes here, they are going to destroy all the cocaine crops, and then we are not going to have anything. So, and I would like also to see the statistics about the 1,400 respondents, how many were from the cities, how many were from rural areas, and also in terms of age, because probably senior people are going to be more against it, and a younger population might be like that. So we like to see more about what was the recruitment of these 1,400 people. And also remember that they have electoral laws, quotas for women. It is 30%. Not only for the party list, but also to be appointed and all the public positions, public positions. But despite that, we see very few support for women.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that. So first on the respondents, and I should say I should have had some statistics here for the backup, and I don't. So I can't give you the exact off the top of my head what the sample ended up being rural versus urban and the different age groups. But I do know that, we worked very closely with the survey firm to make sure that it aligned with what we were seeing in the last census, which is, based on or what percentage of the population was in rural versus urban, and to make sure that the age groups aligned. So yeah, in terms of, so I mean, I guess is your concern that is there some sort of social desirability or something? Yeah, I mean, this certainly could be the case. I think, there's nothing that we can do about this now with what's already been run, but I think, it is something for us to highlight better in the paper. And I mean, we also can reflect on, the experiences of, say, like Victoria Sandino, who was then, run out after she was elected for FARC, and, her kind of reflection on it was that it was the machismo, that, they didn't want a woman in that position. And so that does kind of then call into question of like, well, if we're saying that here that you are actually supporting these women, and then their experiences while in office would suggest that they are not popularly supported, how do we make sense of that? And that is one place where I think that the higher levels of support from women respondents is really interesting too, and something that we have to really dig in more. So I, wonder if we then break down, actual voting patterns of women voters' support for female candidates, what the difference is that we're going to see in Colombia. And so that could be a part of the story there. I will say, like, thinking about the sort of external validity to other cases where rebel parties are operating. So as I said kind of during the presentation, this is really quite a hard case because former rebels are very unpopular in Colombia. And as you said, it's representation is low and it's quite hard for women to get elected, and that is not the case in some of the other places in which we see rebel parties operating. On average, we actually see that rebel parties run and elect significantly more women than other political parties in post-war contexts. And a lot of times when women have participated in war, and then especially when their groups go on to national success in national politics, they really tend to highlight the role of women in their group as like, look at what women did during the conflict, and now we are going to reward them. And so you see really high levels of women's representation, and you see this sort of like celebration of their participation in the conflict. And so, you know, I think in this case, we would expect all of those patterns to be much lower. And so it's still interesting that we found this, but I think there is more to be done to kind of square reality of these findings towards like what's actually happening. Thank you.
Diana and then Jane.
Thank you, Liz. I also have visual comments that are on different levels, but I thank you for your research. I was part of the Truth Commission and then was also participating before that for the Center for Historic Memory. So I was able to work a lot with rebels who were transitioning to incorporación. So this is super interesting. I think it confirms also some of the things that we've been finding in transitional justice, in the transitional justice, what you mentioned about post-war politics continuing to reinforce gender hierarchies and that congruency. I think it's absolutely, we saw it. And for example, the work of Pasha Bueno is an ethnographic work with judges and how they tend to reward women who in their testimonies, they subscribe to classic gender roles. So I think that is super interesting to read your work also in conversation with her work. I was thinking that, yes, when you take M19 and FARC, they are so different that it is very difficult to compare, although I think you're right in the sense that they're in the current discourse, they were lumped together, and being a guerrilla has like a general understanding, and those historic nuances are lost. I was also thinking that, you know, the most recent numbers that we have is that 80% of human rights violations were committed by state agents or with state sanction. So it's crazy that, you know, that to me, it continues to be super interesting. But what you mentioned that, you know, being seen as a soldier was not understood, was not punished if you were, but they are the ones who are the major perpetrators of violence in Colombia. So that is super interesting. So let me just go fast because I have some other things. I was thinking that it would be super interesting to do some research, and this might not be yours, but on how also those candidates who are somewhat successful face a lot of political violence, who is very much overlapped with gender-based violence. And for example, an example that can be you mentioned Victoria's case, which is of course super interesting, but Piedad Córdoba was never a guerrilla fighter, but was understood as a guerrilla sympathizer, and how she was punished by that. I think that those shows, you know, like those understandings that seem to confirm what you're finding in your work, that I think is super interesting. On the hypothetical questions, when you presented the hypothetical characters, I was surprised that running away from gender-based violence was not one of the reasons, and that is the one that I encountered the most. Like with all of the women former combatants that I work with, they were running away from gender-based violence. So that would be, you know, one of those instances that could be very realistic, following Claudia's point. On the urban-rural divide, that is a super good question. Thank you for spotting that. And it is super complex, and it is one of the obsessions of in Colombia, we have a whole social science field that is called violentology, and we study, you know, these kinds of things. So the rural urban, there's so much literature on that, and it shows that it is very complex and has to do a lot with, you know, the specific group and the specific region. And finally, I just wanted to ask you if you consider taking into account trans and non-binary political figures, because they are super important in Colombia. They have been part of the transition. So I was assuming that you were talking about cis men and cis women all the time, but Colombia could be an interesting case for that. And just one final thing that I've forgotten is that when you mentioned that maybe the FARC, guerrilla specifically, and then the political party was like instrumentalizing women, I think yes, and at the same time, the gender chapter was written by them. It was never a concession by the FARC leaders. It was a group of women who decided to write the gender chapter, and that became super important for the different points in the agreement, but it was from them, not from the leaders. That was so many things to say.
Thank you. That's a lot of food for thought. So I'll comment on a couple of these. So we went back and forth for so long about whether we would actually include the group names or if we would just say like a hypothetical former guerrilla candidate and, you know, because there have been some other sort of similar experiments that have been done in Colombia and they have opted to do that instead and have a sort of broader base. But we ended up deciding to include the group names because we felt that you know, there is a lot of bias against both groups, but it is different. And FARC being so much more recent, we assumed that it would invoke much sort of higher levels of bias, which, you know, is what we've seen. And so we thought, you know, it was an interesting way to sort of compare these two groups, even though so much gets lost in just that simple comparison. But, you know, the time component also is interesting. Like it has been several decades since M19 signed their agreement versus FARC, you know, almost a decade. And so kind of being able, and that's also like realistic in other cases where you have several rebel groups that transition into political parties, is to that, you know, it happens at different points in time and that might very much influence how they are seen. So we were hoping to kind of capture that there by having the group names, but you know, as I do agree with you that a lot gets sort of kind of washed. So yes, we also had a hard time narrowing down the all of these categories. There was so much that could have been included and we had like for every attribute, we had way too many levels and had to eventually whittle them down. But it would have been a good idea to have included the gender-based violence as well. We do take, a very binary approach to gender, but that is, you know, something we can take into account for future iterations. Yeah, it would be interesting to then expand that. We are, you know, in this focusing on cis women and men, but we could certainly not, you know, expand that in the future. Thank you so much.
Jason, and then we have one online and then.
Thank you, Lizzie. A couple, I guess, three competing stories or perhaps mechanisms, maybe supplementary, I don't know. So one, is your result driven by people who don't really want to vote for Rebel at all, and they just find the people who they think are less committed? And gender is like one way that they stereotype this person's not as much of a rebel, you know, and like did they use violence and all these other things are also, you know, were they a medic, right? Like, and so perhaps like this is like the high approval rating among Republicans for Joe Manchin, right? But like the Democrats hate Joe Manchin. It's like the rebel voter base or something like that, like doesn't like these candidates, but like the sort of, you know, general public also doesn't like these candidates, so they like them a little better. So if you have like who these voters were going to support, you know, as a sort of measure, maybe that would speak to this. Second competing, or sorry, I don't know, like alternative story. So the case I know the best, you know, the Chinese sort of rebels, right? Like many of the highest ranking female rebels, you know, owed their position to like some relationship with their sort of romantic partner, right? So it seemed like there was a lot of gendered attitudes towards these people, and sometimes they get couched in like they feel like it's nepotistic to elevate, you know, Mao's wife into the Gang of Four or something like this. And so I wonder if these sort of gender preferences are tied to like what the voters imagine the nomination process is. Like if they don't know what the nomination process is and then they're not presented in this way, right? Like maybe they don't see this, but outside of the sort of experimental setting, like the like, why did you join, you know, like following a romantic partner, that seems like something that someone would spread about you, like if they were against you, right? As opposed to like a story you tell for yourself. And so I think that perhaps gender is capturing like attitudes towards, you know, meritocracy or nepotism or something like this, like resentment within the rebel organization that like this person has a higher rank than they should because of their, you know, not their own achievements or, you know, whatever it is. Third, competing or supplementary question. This is related to this finding that you alluded to at the end about, you know, in contexts where they have more women represented, like more, the rebel organizations are recruiting more women. Is that because those are contexts where the rebel organizations have less power and they need to persuade more, and then they do the strategic thing? And if they had more power, then they wouldn't do this, you know? And so the good outcomes could be driven by their, you know, lack of power in these places and the need to try to persuade as opposed to use other tools to get support.
Thank you. So there's a lot to think about. So on the first point, is this driven by people who like don't support Rebel, who don't really want to vote for them? And are like just picking kind of the worst, or the least bad of what they see as the worst. I mean, you know, ideally, it would be great if we could pull that apart from the people who actually do support these groups and understand if there is some sort of difference between these two types of respondents. And I could see a good argument in the way that there would be. Unfortunately, you know, we didn't include a question about, do you support either of these groups? I think certainly we would have not gotten very honest answers from anyone, given that they're pretty controversial groups. I think the social desirability bias there would have been very high. So I don't know that there was any way for us to pull apart those who are supporting rebels and those who don't. But I think at the same time, like, even if this is being driven by people who are picking kind of the least bad of the worst, that is still part of the story, right? Is that gender is influencing who they view to be the least bad. And that really aligns with what we know about women's roles in rebel groups and rebel parties sort of more broadly, in that they can alter how the group is viewed, and very much are judged by, judged on their decision to join by their gender. So I think that kind of is a part of the story, even if we can't tease apart those two mechanisms. The second part about the relationship to top leaders. So this is common, right, in a lot of places. It's common in Colombia, where I've done a lot of field work in Uganda. You see this as well. I mean, in Uganda, the war ended in the 80s, but still, like, people talk about the women who participated and who have had like decades-long careers in government as being 70s men or some 70s women, and like, you know, whisper about their positions being attributed to wartime relationships. And I hear what you're saying about it could be related to capturing meritocracy, but in that case, we would actually expect the opposite, right? If that was the case, and this was like, unless they all really support or if they don't support meritocracy, then why would we see that female rebels are being supported at such high levels, right? So this kind of, and also then the punishment for those who are being recruited, who are joining because they were following a romantic partner, being so much harsher suggests that, you know, that is something that's capturing into the story, but in that single mechanism and not driving the overall gendered effect. And then, yeah, the last part about, the general kind of lit on rebel parties, and women's roles in them, and whether it's a strategic thing. So, in general, you know, I kind of across my work, looking at the level of women's representation in rebel parties, I always account for the number of seats the party has, and it never has an effect on the outcome of women's representation. So across parties that have a lot of seats, across parties that don't have a lot of seats, so powerful versus less powerful, they still elect a lot of women. And this is also the case for the work where we show that the level of representation of female rebels has positive outcomes. They have positive outcome or have positive effects on outcomes, even in cases where rebels don't hold a lot of seats. And we argue that this happens for a couple of reasons. So it's very common that you see these women mobilizing together as a coalition, and then also mobilizing coalitions with other women MPs and working together to focus on things like women's rights and legislation relevant to women. And it's also the case that these women then are, due to their wartime connections, very kind of central in the party networks. And this makes it a bit easier then for them to actually convince party leadership to adopt certain sort of stances and policies that then make it easier to achieve those outcomes. So yeah, thank you.
Did you have a two finger on exactly that? Oh, no.
I had a separate question.
Oh, separate. Okay, let me put you on the list then. Sorry. So we had, we need to go to one online, and then I think. And then you got it. Okay, online, Jorge asked, how would you say these findings help inform the impact of including or supporting women in public leadership roles with ties to rebel groups versus including men with similar ties for those roles and their effect on long-term positive versus negative impacts on stability or peace efforts?
Yeah, so and what I was just alluding to is my book project. I look at the effect on stability, so on post-war peace duration, and on the likelihood of conflict relapse. And so I see that higher levels of representation of female rebels leads to longer peace duration, lower likelihood of conflict relapse. I don't see the same thing with male rebels. And so, you know, kind of pulling that back to this study, I kind of part of my assumption there is that, I mean, it could be the other effects that these female MPs are having on policy, but it also may be the sorts of assumptions that it brings up about, say, quality of governance and their commitment to peace and these sorts of things, right? We have lots of research that shows that women MPs in general are seen as like more democratic, less corrupt, more committed to good governance. And so I think that's kind of part of what also could be driving that.
So Simon, and then we had one back there and then Anais, since you were asking.
Jorge asked my question. I had my second question, but I have one more. This is like probably the worst question because it's more like a lawyery type of question. But the title of your paper is the gender dynamics of ex-combatants, and I was wondering about the word combatant.
Yeah.
Because like, correct me if I'm wrong, because I have like zero geopolitical knowledge of the situation of Colombia.
Yeah.
And we are talking about like infighting, like a civil war type of scenario, like rebels against the government. So that's important. Because I was wondering whether there is a correlation between the type of the conflict we are talking about, like a guerrilla type of warfare, like rebels versus their own government, sort of way, versus like guerrilla warfare in situation where we are talking more about like insurgents against like an occupational force, for example, and whether there is a difference in perception of women fighting against like opposing like an occupational force versus women fighting against, because like I guess like my intuition would suggest that it would be much more forgiving in a occupational force scenario than in like a rebel infighting scenario, especially in those like physical violence examples. It would be much more flat in those because like you're killing the enemy, not your neighbor. Sometimes in civil war.
Right. So yeah, first time that I laughed a little bit when you said combatant, because that was something I clocked earlier today of, you know, first put the title together way back.
The lawful combatant and unlawful combatant would be like those I guess would be like unlawful combatants under like international humanitarian law.
Yeah, I guess I was thinking more of just that, you know, I would like to replace combatant with just rebel, because this is especially like in the gender literature, a big sort of contention of like who gets called a rebel or even, you know, a combatant is a line of like who is on the front line. But lots of other people in other support positions are very important, are still full members. So I think we will be changing combatant to a broader term. But then, yeah, in terms of like lawful versus unlawful and occupational force. So I mean, I don't have an exact answer for you. But I mean, I think that you are likely onto something. I mean, we can think about like Ukraine. You see like news stories all the time about, you know, the women teachers who gave up their jobs and now they're fighting on the front lines, right? And I mean, that's used very much also as a sort of a propaganda tool in a way to sort of like bolster support in a similar way to what we actually see with rebel groups. But I think it's probably much more effective, to your point, based on what the composition is.
Like Second World War, like Soviet posters of like women fighting and of course Polish. This is like maybe more niche story. So yeah, I think there's
Yeah.
something.
But yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, thank you.
One,
Hey, I have, first, thank you for your presentation and lots of interesting thing that I learned. And I think, just similar to, his comment, but it's not a really question, but it's just a sharing, and I'm curious about the fighting. And I'm curious about the gender stereotypes that, the groups expect their candidates. So it seems like they construct the criteria or the expectations for the group leaders or the candidates. I'm thinking about the situation of the post-war grassroots organizations and the contemporary profit and non-profit organizations when the figure of the women, I mean, the women who expected to be leader, who are altruists, who are working for the communities benefits, but I want to know about, I'm curious about, like, in your study groups, the power structure in the organization post-election. I mean, like,
Yeah.
so 60% of the rebel groups are women, but the power, the actual power of the leadership, how does that look like? Yeah, that is like, we can construct a figure, a leader, but the power maybe is hidden or driven by a group behind her.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. And I don't have a clean answer for you, but I think it's important. So like more or less kind of how are these candidates being chosen? What is the selection process? Who actually gets final say? Does that kind of accurately describe what you're asking a bit?
Yeah, and after that, like after, when they are successful, when they are selected, and how the structure, the power structure in the leadership. And will the power really in their hands or distributed differently? I don't know, yeah.
Yeah, so I've wondered this a lot of, how does the wartime power structure then transition to the party? And in some cases you see that it can kind of cleanly map on based on the type of rebel group, right? Like if they had pretty like robust rebel governance, political wings, it's much easier to translate that sort of organization into a political party because they already have some of those structures there. In cases where they don't, we see that there's a lot more sort of kind of chaotic remaking of the organization when you transition to post-war politics. But in terms of where women fit into that, that is something that I have really like tried now across my career to figure out. And it seems that in some ways it's not quite what we would always expect. So like a lot of like the work that I mentioned before I've done in Uganda, that has shown that typically the women who were at the top sort of military positions, which you would assume could then move, like if they're in the top leadership, they will continue to be in the top leadership. They typically did not enter politics. It was primarily women who were in more sort of support roles because I think that was the more gender conforming, more palatable to the public kind of role. In some work that I have ongoing in Nepal, I've also tried to trace like what the candidate selection procedures were like. And for the most part, so you see there basically almost none of the women who were elected after the peace agreement was signed were those who were on the front line fighting. It was all women who had been in the political wing. And when you ask them like, so how are you picked as a candidate? Like, how did this all happen? They're just like, I was told. Like the party leadership told me I was running, and so I ran. And so, I mean, it's very unclear how it happens, but it does seem as if the women themselves are perhaps not always having a ton of say in those decisions. Thank you. That was a great question.
Okay, I think this is maybe potentially our last question.
All right.
Last.
So I was wondering if in the conjoint one, when you have the non-rebel candidates, did you guys also test for whether or not the hypothetical candidate was like a victim of the conflict? What were your results?
We didn't find any results there either. Yeah. We did find some other interesting like subgroup patterns, particularly like the degree to which they were hawkish or dovish and the degree to which they supported the negotiated settlement had a pretty significant effect. So those that were more hawkish were generally like more likely to support those who had been rebels, but not female rebels. I think kind of some of those like hawkish attitudes also can be very masculine. And so then they were less likely to support the females. Same with negotiated settlement. So those who were in favor of the negotiated settlement, probably unsurprising, were then more likely than the others to support the guerrilla candidates and specifically like female rebels. Yeah. Yeah, I was also.
Based on the forced recruitment results, I was guessing that there might have been like that through line of like victim of conflict. But that's very interesting that there's not.
Did the, similarly, just follow up on the one experiment, did the education results hold up there as well?
No, off the top of my head, the check.
'Cause I was thinking of Jason's question as well. Like, is there something about, I mean, like the medics, right, seem to do really well,
Yeah.
regardless of gender, but even better if they're women. Right, but also like university educated seem to do really well, and so I'm sort of wondering if there's something of this of like, you know, I transition out of the field and into like a, you know, like I have the capacity to do this from like a cerebral perspective, right? And that's sort of mapped in the medic and university sort of education context. And so like there's almost like a smart women, right? Kind of thing, which is kind of well, but like I was just sort of thinking if that's something that you've reflected on, it goes a little bit to this meritocracy question and how they, what the sort of maybe cultural thinking development there.
Well, I think it's the more that they look like a traditional candidate as well, right? I think that it makes it, you know, much
A traditional
easier.
female candidate or a
Yes,
traditional
female candidate. Yeah, so yeah, looking at education, then we do see the sort of, you know, the same sort of pattern. Musical education is the lowest, then technical, and then university the highest. And the first one we didn't break down by specific role in the rebel organization, since we then weren't only comparing rebel candidates. So yeah, I'm not sure like where the medic would fall in that, but yeah, that's a great point.
Just like
Final
a short comment, but because I think your comments were actually like quite similar. To this, like you're alluding to, it just came to my mind, like the most critical question for this is whether the conflict changes anything. Because like even like if we look at this, especially what you asked about, what you told us about like the percentages of women being chosen as governors or something.
Yeah.
Like whether the fact that someone participated in like rebellion or other form of armed conflict, like coming back to my question a bit as well, does this change the like electoral choices of voters? Like someone wouldn't vote for a woman before,
Yeah.
and after he learned that she participated in an armed conflict as a combatant, lawful, unlawful, doesn't matter. He probably can change his mind, and then because there is a chance, there is like a risk, maybe like biggest risk for that would be that if you remove the conflict part from that, it's just the same.
Yeah.
Like we don't have exactly if for example like a lawyer, a doctor, whatever, like those professions, it would be exactly the same. Traditionally, professions traditionally associated with women would have more leeway. For example, like a medic. Traditionally, if men would have exactly like this. There is a question whether there is something in rebellion, or like a guerrilla warfare or a warfare broadly, that is like an. I am very like careful with using the word, but like an empowerment tool to some extent. Very like badly associated like toxic empowerment tool for a society as a whole, but some sort of empowerment tool.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, like if alternatively, it could have been, we could have set it up now, say you have two candidates, say nothing about their wartime experience, everything else is the same, and then afterwards you reveal this candidate was in the group.
It's like 13%. So for example, without rebellion, there would be like 7.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's basically the growth.
Last question, the experiment, how many people voted? Meant as how many ones?
Sorry, can you say that?
Individual vote.
Wait a minute, how many people actually said I will vote for a woman compared to a non-rebel?
So I mean, this was the interaction, right? So they were generally less favored compared to than
Because
women
I'm wondering
civilians.
why, the fact that now we have an ex-guerrilla member as a president,
Yeah.
that might affect people's responses. Because the same way that there are people in favor, there are also a lot of people against it.
Right.
Okay, I want to give Lizzie an opportunity just to say any summary comment, and then I want to thank her, and then we can continue. Anyone who would like to continue the discussion, there's, I think, still food possibly in the other, so opportunity to summarize.
Well, I guess my summary, like I said, this was our first time presenting this. So this was incredibly helpful to get all of your feedback and to see what sorts of things you had questions about, what we need to emphasize more and what we need to pull apart more. So I really just want to say thank you so much. This was really helpful. And I'm very grateful for the opportunity to present.